Welcome, everybody. Now, I am out here on this cool December day, and it's kind of got me distracted, I have to admit it. It's kind of gotten me to where I'm not remembering what my purpose for these videos is. It's like I had a theme for them, and I'm sort of forgetting what it is. And, it's strange. What the heck? It would be really nice if there was something very noticeable that happened on a set schedule, short, maybe a couple times a day. Something that would remind me of where I am and what it is that I intend to do with these things. Something that would just snap me right back into place. And, it would just be a really nice thing. And I just kind of wonder what that would be like. What kind of thing would do such would be such a little boon to me. Oh, yeah. To get the full effect. That'll do nicely. That will remind me that I happen to live in a rural community right near a small town. You need not worry, it is not a warning that a tornado is coming or a nuclear strike, I suppose. That, in fact, would be the sound that would warn you of those things. But in this case, it is what we call the noon whistle from the nearest small town. The small town's starts about half mile up the road, and the sound that you heard comes from just past the main intersection there, and so it's more like a little over a mile from here. And that town has both a noon whistle and a 6 o'clock whistle. That's PM, not AM, thankfully. But I put those in quotes for a couple of reasons. First off, that's not a whistle, is it? It's a civil defense or air raid or tornado siren. Something designed to warn you of approaching danger. And the second reason is that it is now 11:51, and that whistle has been creeping earlier year over year for quite some time now. It now goes off at about 11:49 and 30 seconds, roughly, and the other one at about 5:49 and 30 seconds. It's been doing that for years, and nobody's bothered to fix it. Go in and adjust it so that it goes off at the actual set times that they're supposed to go off, because, small towns, am I right? This is not my job. Maybe when it gets to be about 30 minutes early, somebody will actually do something about it. Who knows? We shall see. But yeah, comes from a very small town right up the road. So it sits on about 1 square mile of land. Has about 200 residents. It's tiny. Now those kind of noon and 6 p.m. whistles, they're not universal to all small towns, at least not anymore. Now, back when those electronic civil defense sirens were put in back in the 50s during the Cold War, to warn us of the imminent nuclear war that thankfully never happened, they probably were a lot closer to universal. But, they've been phased out in a lot of small towns. But quite a few still have them, and this nearby one is one of them. Now, the next nearest small town is over that way. It's about a 6-mile drive down the road, but they have an air raid siren as well, a civil defense that does noon whistles, or at least they did back recently when we were building this place, when I was outside a lot. And the siren itself is about 4 miles away, and sirens don't have to travel down roads like I do, and they don't have to go down roads, make right and left turns to get to your place. They go in a straight line. So it's about 4 miles. And the effective audible range for those things is really only about 2 miles. But with the right atmospheric conditions, and if there's not a whole lot of traffic or people using heavy equipment or something like that around here, you can hear that one. At least we could while we were making this house, while we were building this house, working on the land around it and stuff. You could hear it if it wasn't too noisy around. just, faintly in the right conditions. So, so they still have one, or at least had one very recently. And that town's significantly bigger. It's got about 10 times the population, about 2,000 people, and they still have one too. So, it's not limited to just teeny tiny little places, but, somewhat larger places. And, yeah. So, they got phased out over the years. They had, they co-opted those sirens, which were put in because of, the nuclear threat from during the Cold War. They co-opted them for a couple of things. They co-opted them for those whistles, and they co-opted them for to call out like a volunteer fire department, which we do have in that little town there. Just to let the actual volunteers know that it's time to go to the fire hall and get on the trucks and go out for a call. It was a good way to do that. But, those things have been, both of those things have been sort of superseded by modern technology. I mean, I just had my cell phone out to show you the time. So, yeah. Just about everybody has one of those, and, you don't need the sirens to do it anymore, but a lot of places still use them because it's tradition, momentum. Something's going, it's hard to stop it from going. So, yeah, they do that. Now, why those times? Well, and why do they do it in general? It's sort of the modern, or at least modern for the 1950s, successor to the church bell. Back for, from the Middle Ages on, depending on when your area in Europe adopted Christianity, and, well into more modern times, the church bell would ring off like every hour, during the day at least. I don't think they did it at night. People had to sleep. It'd be awfully rude to be woken up every hour. But yeah, they would, it would tell you what time it was. Back then, clocks weren't a thing. Even pendulum clocks were pretty rare and a much later invention. And, certainly not wristwatches or anything like that, where you could carry a timepiece with you. That was much later. So, you needed something like that to tell you what time it was. And this is sort of the modern successor to that. Now, they don't ring it off every hour like the church bell. It would be madness. But they do ring it off at certain specific times of the day that are important. Now, we have noon and 6 p.m., and those are some of the most common ones. Some will have one or the other, or not both. And apparently some places, some small towns, would have even more. I've read accounts online from people who grew up in other small towns that they would have a whistle at like 7 a.m. It's sort of a town-wide alarm clock, I guess. Sounds fun. And some mentioned even maybe one at 9 p.m., sort of a curfew whistle, tell the young people to get inside, get off the street, you hooligans. Almost time to go to bed. We only have noon and 6 p.m., so thankfully. But then why noon and 6 p.m.? Why are those the most common? And that's because you have to think about like what small towns are like. Generally they exist in agricultural communities where if you don't live right in the center of the small town itself, you are probably a farmer, and so you do you're out there in the fields, you're out there working. And farmers, even with the common use of wristwatches and things like that, probably wouldn't have used them because you're doing a lot of hard labor. You're going to bang it into something and break it, or you're going to get it caught on something and it would be an actual danger to you. So yeah, you generally don't want to wear too much extra stuff hanging off of you. So they wouldn't, and they would need to be told about certain key times of the day, specifically meal times. Noon and 6 p.m. is times for lunch and dinner. Now, I have a tangent to go off on the names of lunch and dinner and such and what they might have been called around here, but it would make this video a little bit long, and I don't really want to do that. So I am going to make a separate video with sort of an appendix to this one, and sort of footnotes that have come out soon after, And so pay attention for that. And this will be the first one of those about the meal times. So I'll mention when I'm gonna where my tangents would be for you that are gonna be put into a separate video. So watch out for that. So yeah, so they needed to be told about the meals. They were hungry. They'd been out there a lot of times. If you worked at a dairy farm, especially, which is what a lot of the people around here did. And, quite a few still do, but not as many as they used to be. I mean, I look around here and there's not a farm that I can see, but there are some fairly close by in both directions. So they're out there. They do happen still, and so it could still be useful to somebody. Now, I kind of doubt that it is because, like I showed you my cell phone, everybody carries one of those. You put that in your pocket, it's not hanging off your body. It's not something that's going to get stuck on anything. But, and also your equipment. I'd imagine that, even everything else has clocks in it now. I'd imagine that your tractors and such also have them. So, yeah, it's probably not quite as important to them anymore. But it was important back then. You'd be out working. If you were doing a dairy farm, you had to get up, usually before the sun rose to milk those cows. You milk those things 2 or 3 times a day, depending on what your schedule is like. And you got to feed them. You got to do a lot of work with them. You got to clean up after them because they poop everywhere. You can't just leave that sitting around in your barn or your milking parlor or whatever else you're doing. You got to clean it up, and so. It's a lot of work, and you've been at it for several hours by noon, and you need to get in to eat, to get energy, to be able to do it for the rest of the day. So, that was what that warned you about, and the same for the 6 p.m. one for your dinner time. You would need to go in and eat. You might even go out a little bit after that, but for the most part, you were probably just about done for the day. And so that's what those are for. That's why those times, and that's what they do. When I was a kid and we moved to LA, the first few summers afterward, we were sent, my brother and I were sent back here to stay with my dad's parents right here in this county. My parents were working. We were young. At the beginning of that summer, I turned 4 that next summer after we moved there. And my older brother was like 7.5. He wouldn't turn 8 until later in the year, like November. So, yeah. So, my parents didn't think it was a great idea that they'd be working all the time and leaving a 7.5-year-old in charge of himself and his 4-year-old little brother. So they sent us back here. And they did it for that year and the next couple of years after that. And so we would stay with my dad's parents. But since my other grandparents and my aunts and uncles and all my cousins all lived in this county at that time, we would stay mostly with my dad's parents, but they would take us to my other grandparents, my mom's parents, who lived maybe 5 miles from here. My dad's parents lived like 20 some miles to the north and such, a little bit west. But but they would bring us here, and we'd stay with them for a week or so. And from there, we would actually go to this nearest little town because my aunt and uncle both lived there. My mom's sister and her family, and my mom's brother and his family both lived there. My mom's sister, hi Pam, she had married a man who lived in that town his whole life, and she'd moved in with him, as you do. So, so she was there. And then my mom's brother, when he came back from the army, shortly after, he bought a building in that town that had been a former dance hall back in the early 1900s. It had fallen into disrepair, and he bought it, and he fixed it up, and he converted it into apartments. And we would generally stay at his place because, he had the big building made for apartments. He was still in the process of getting them all up and running and ready to go at that time. And, so we would stay there with him and his wife and kids and my cousins. And so, yeah, and one thing about it was that no memory of the whistle from that town, from that time, because they didn't do it back then. They had stopped, and later on would pick it up again. Weird, right? Well, since my uncle had converted this place into apartments, he became a landlord and caretaker and everything for the place. He did all the work around the place, all the maintenance, all the upkeep, the lawn work, the snow removal in the winter, all of that stuff. But he's self-employed, and he supplemented that with what he had been trained to do, from growing up with his own father. He was a stonemason. He worked with brick and cement and things like that. So he supplemented it with that too. But in both of those cases, he was his own boss and he could set his own schedule. And he was fairly convinced, either just through suspicion or being told by somebody who was there, that the town council in that town had brought back the whistles, specifically the noon whistle, in part at least just to annoy him. And he was probably right. It's fairly easy to see it happening. If you have a town of 200 and there's like 5 people on the council, they can do that. They can change the laws to single somebody out to annoy. And the idea was he since he set his own schedule, he liked to stay up late and go to bed late and get up late. And the noon whistle was probably brought back. It was either the late 80s or into the 90s. I'm not entirely sure about this. This is a secondhand story told by him to my parents and later conveyed to me. And unfortunately, neither he nor my parents are around anymore, so I can't get any clarification, any additional information on it. So you're just going to have to go with what I know from this remembered secondhand story. But, yeah, he had told them that he probably, that they had probably done that one, at least in part to annoy him, to brought it back to annoy him, make sure that he would be up at least by noon. Jeez, what is with that guy? He gets to sleep in late like that, man. And, it's highly believable. The thing about that is, what was done to annoy him back in the late 80s or the 90s or whatever, since he passed about 5 years ago, it now is there every time I hear it. It's a reminder of my uncle that I loved. And so for those people who were doing that to annoy him, I should, if they're still around, I should probably thank them, because they gave me a memento every day of my uncle. So it's kind of cool. But yeah, took some adjusting to when I moved here, boy, because like I said, it wasn't there when I was a kid, and it was something. It is there for a lot of people. If you grew up in even a big city in the U.S. where tornadoes can be a possibility, you probably hear that thing. Not only for actual tornado warnings, but they likely test it once a month. And we don't have to do that here because they set it off twice a day at the very least, so we know that it works. No need for testing. And but if you grew up like where I did in LA, they don't have tornadoes, like, ever. So they didn't use them for that. They didn't use them for the warnings for that. They didn't test them. They didn't do anything. They were there. They were ubiquitous. They put them in all over the country because nuclear war. But they didn't bother using them in LA. They had things that they could possibly use them for, like wildfires. Wildfires were never super close to our house. They tend to be toward the hillsides and stuff like that. It tends to be where they spark off and where they burn up the most. Where there's more open vegetation and things to burn. So that's where they tend to be. But they were close enough. There were times when ash was falling out of the sky on us. So within a few miles, you would hear those sirens if they were going off within a few miles to tell you that there was a fire around. But they just didn't use them for that. At least not around where I lived in LA. And there's also mudslides, sort of a follow-up to the fires they could have used them for. but you don't get a whole lot of advance warning on mudslides. You kind of know where they might happen, but there's all kinds of it's still on the hillsides, things that have been burned away. If all that vegetation is burned away, and the grass and everything like that, it's gonna, it leaves the dirt loose, so that when it rains the next winter, which is the rainy season there, there's a good chance that that stuff's gonna slide down the side of the mountain. But you don't know where or if it's going to happen anywhere, so there's not a whole lot of advance warning on it. So they didn't really use it for that either. I don't remember any significant mudslides around us, in that time. So not really close to where we were. So maybe they do in some places, but they certainly didn't around us. And then there's the other thing. There's earthquakes. Now, there's absolutely no advance warning on an earthquake. It just happens. I happened to live through the Northridge earthquake in '94, and it was real close. It was very close to us, and it was certainly something. You don't get advance warning to tell you about it, and they certainly don't need it. You certainly don't need a siren if it's close enough to cause significant damage or loss of life or something like that around your house, because the whole world around you is shaking. You're very aware that an earthquake is happening. It does not take long to figure it out. So yeah, no sirens for that either. And, there's another point, the tangent that I will go off on in another video about the earthquake. That'll be another footnote for the companion video to this. And it actually sort of leads into the other one about how I know that the sirens were there in LA. It's another tangent, another little story. So yeah, pay attention for those. They're coming up. So yeah, it was definitely something to get used to. Like I said, it hadn't been here when I visited as a kid, but when we moved back, we lived in that town for the first 2.5 years. Before we bought this land and built the buildings here and the house to live in and such, we lived in town for 2.5 years. And that first night, we lived right across the street. We rented another apartment in another building that my uncle owned by that time, and we were maybe 100 yards from where that siren is, so it was real loud. I should probably do a video there, just a short one. I could show you the buildings, and I could have you hear just exactly how loud that siren is when it goes off right by you in that distance. It's something. You get to hear the full effect of it too. It's not only is it louder, but it lasts longer, because those things are, it's electronic and electrically charged. It runs a little motor that spins something around that makes the noise. Now, when the electricity hits it, there's very little. It's like less than a 1 second buildup. It's what? It's right up to full volume. But when the electricity stops at the end, there's no brake on the thing that spins around and on the motor. So it's just got to lose momentum through friction. So you get to hear this long, several second drug out thing of it winding down. So it just goes, for several seconds. It's quite something to hear. Yeah, it was something. We got there in the afternoon, so the first one I would have heard would have been a 6 p.m. one, and it's like, it's shocking. It's what is this? Is it an air raid? Are we back in World War II? Do I need to turn out the lights? But no, it was just people. It's just 6 o'clock. Happens every day. You'll get used to it, and you do. It's not to a point where you can just completely not notice that it happens, because it's incredibly noticeable, but it stops being like any kind of shock to you. It's just like you hear it, and like maybe for a split second you wonder what it is, but you're like, oh yeah, it's that time of day. Time for the whistle. It's quite something. It was quite the difference from where I came from to hearing that every day. But in a week or so, you're pretty used to it. By now, it's not much of anything. But yeah, it's definitely something to adjust to. I was inspired to make this video by a YouTube creator named Scott Kramer. It's very good. It's funny. He's got good insights on things. You should check him out. He mostly does things about media, like, TV shows, movies, things like that. But that's, probably half. The other half is just sort of random ideas that he comes up with. And one of those random ideas this very summer led to this video. He grew up in a small town in North Dakota, and he now lives in Fargo, big city in North Dakota. And this summer, he decided to go back to not only his small town, where they apparently didn't have noon or 6 p.m. whistles, but also to a couple of other small towns nearby, and maybe a little farther away for the third one, that he had some kind of connection to, for what they call their summer festivals. Just about every small town of a significant size to support one has a summer festival. And this is another note, this is like the final footnote for the video to see in the follow-up about summer festivals. I will talk a little bit about summer festivals around here. I'm not going to ever do a full video on them, because we do have them. Any small town in America of a significant size probably has a summer festival every year. It's just a very widespread thing. It's something to do out in rural America. So they all generally kind of have them. And we have them around here, and I will talk about it in the other video. But anyway, he went first to his old hometown, then to a near one week, and then to another week, probably maybe even the next week. I think it was the next weekend. He went to another nearby small town that he had some kind of connection to, and he mentions, just as a matter of fact, like a good chunk of the way through the section about that town's festival, that just suddenly the siren went off, and nobody around me seemed to be even taking much notice of it. That's the thing. It was likely the 6 p.m. whistle, just based on all the stuff that he'd already done that day. It's possible they crammed a bunch of stuff in early and it was a noon one. I don't know. I'm thinking he was probably off doing something around noon, and there was a lot of hustle and bustle, and he barely heard the 6 p.m. or the noon whistle, and that was the 6 p.m. that he was doing. Or maybe they do it at a different time in that town. Who knows? But whatever it was, he was quite alarmed by it, but nobody else around him was noticing it, and that's what it's like. if you didn't grow up with it, if you didn't experience it all the time, it's startling. But if you live there, it's pretty normal. It's just part of your day-to-day life, and that's what it's like. So that's about it for this topic. I thank you all for watching. You can do all the stuff down below here. If you come from a small town that had noon or 6 p.m. whistles, or any other time of day, leave a comment about that. Whatever. And I hope you were entertained by this. Maybe you learned something. And I hope you all have the best possible day that you can have. And I will see you soon. Take care.